It absolutely starts with all of us. And I want to bring up Dennis Yule. Dennis, you want to join me up here? Dennis served as Superior Court Judge for Benton Franklin counties for 23 years. He retired in 2009. He has continued to be very busy and continues to be involved with programs and projects at the state and the local, state, and national levels, particularly related to minorities in justice, access to justice, juvenile justice, and specialty courts, and clearly has his own starring role now as a media personality. So thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning. Just in case any of you missed it, I am Bridget's grandpa. That's my most prized credential. Mary Ellen, thank you very much for permitting me to be part of the program this morning and for your unflagging leadership of KSARC. Maybe it's appropriate right at this time to say your persistent leadership of KSARC. This may exceed my time slot, but I want to just very briefly ask everyone who is working at KSARC, all the staff that are present here this morning, to stand up. We need to see all of you, and thank you for your work. If you could all just stand for a moment. I am so honored and privileged to be a part of this breakfast, and I am just as moved and inspired this morning as I was at my first Be Loud breakfast last year. In the late 70s, I was a young deputy prosecutor in a small eastern Washington county. There were 3 of us in the prosecutor's office. Prosecution was new to me. I'd started out my legal career in civil law, and sexual assault cases were foreign to me, and I dreaded those cases. I really dreaded those cases. Several assault cases involving children came along. Those cases involving child victims of sexual violence were excruciating for me. Every one of those cases that I had to deal with broke my heart. One of those cases is seared into my memory. A first grade teacher systematically selected students that were particularly vulnerable, all of them children of Latino farm workers, except 2. 2 were receiving special education assistance. The teacher groomed each of them and repeatedly molested them over nearly an entire school year. It was an abysmal case. And as I was struggling with that case, I remembered hearing about a place over in Seattle called Rape Relief. And I gave it a call. And I got a call back from a wonderful person there who gave me some very helpful advice and information. She sent me a list of articles and books and reference materials and the names of some prosecutors around the state that had special expertise in dealing with child sex abuse cases. And she sent me a book that had just come out called He Told Me Not to Tell. That book, incidentally, started here at KSARC and is now used literally throughout the world. Well, Rape Relief got me through that case, and it changed my entire perspective. It helped me to see that just responding to sexual assault with a broken heart, the shake of a head, a sigh of resignation, make us complicit in the continuation of the scourge of sexual violence that still is among us in our communities. For 11 years that I was in the prosecutor's office, I continued to look to then Case ARC for information and advice, and I always got it. I became a Superior Court judge, and during the 23 years that I served on the bench over in the Tri-Cities, Case ARC continued to be a really invaluable resource for me on the bench and for other judges around the state through trainings and presentations at judicial conferences and resource materials. We all knew about Case ARC and the assistance that it could provide. A year ago, I was here for my first Be Loud breakfast. And you know, when I heard about this Be Loud breakfast, that was a new term to me and a new concept. But I certainly get it now, and I think we all got it from what we have heard already this morning. I was transfixed at that breakfast by the stories I was hearing. Gripping stories like Walter's, that we're so grateful that you had the courage to share with us. Stories of pain and suffering and hopelessness, and also soaring stories of joy and accomplishment and hopefulness. I'd heard many stories like those over the course of 34 years that I was a prosecutor and then a judge. But the stories I heard here last year and the courage and strength of those sharing them were so moving, and the accounts of the work that Case ARC was doing, the things that it was accomplishing to move toward that vision of a world without sexual violence were so inspiring to me. A week before that breakfast last year, Bridget, she's my granddaughter, Bridget and I were having one of our occasional late night conversations about the problems of the world and how we were going to solve them, how she was going to solve them. I'd already had my chance. And she mentioned that a friend at school had disclosed to her that she had been sexually assaulted. And Bridget told me that her friend's disclosure really made her think about what could be done and about what wasn't being done at Roosevelt High School, where she was a student, to address the issue of sexual violence among high school kids. And she shared with me ideas and plans that she and her friends already had and steps that they had already begun taking to do something about sexual violence at Roosevelt. Well, that conversation was an epiphany to me. It reminded me that today's young people are a lot more perceptive and sensitive to the world around them than I was at their age, and much more ready to engage in that world around them than I was at that age. And here was my granddaughter already engaging, already being loud, and I didn't even know about it. Well, the breakfast was about a week away. What an amazing convergence of events. So I told Bridget about the breakfast, and I told her that I was going to be coming over for the breakfast, and I asked her if she would like to go with me. And Bridget, being Bridget, said, "I'd love to, Grandpa." And so sitting next to me at last year's breakfast was Bridget, who hadn't heard all the stories that she was hearing that morning, and who was just beginning to learn about the efforts of places like Case ARC to overcome sexual violence. And I could see that she was deeply moved and impacted by what she had heard, who she had met. One of those being Rachel Taylor, the prevention services specialist at Case ARC, who readily and very generously gave Bridget the tools and encouragement and support she needed to continue the work that she and her friends had already begun at Roosevelt. I am so proud of Bridget, you may have noticed, so proud of how she tackled the challenge of bringing sexual assault prevention work to her school. That is not an easy challenge for a high school student. It's not an easy challenge for any of us. Fortunately, there are other young people like Bridget who ask how they can do this in their own schools, and adults who ask how they can do this in their own communities. The simple answer is that whoever we are, wherever we are, whatever resources we have, each of us can do something. And each of us has a responsibility to do something about sexual assault. Over the years, I've gotten to know Deanne Yamamoto, who is the Deputy Executive Director at KSARC, and I can tell you that there is no more ardent and effective advocate for the prevention of sexual violence than Deanne Yamamoto. She has a clear, focused vision of a world without sexual violence. And when she says in a video about the work of KSARC that sexual violence prevention is possible, Deanne is not kidding. She does not take no, or it's not possible, or we can't do this as an answer. And neither can we. What it takes to create a world without sexual violence is not just amazing persons like Bridget and extraordinary advocates like Deanne, but hundreds, all of us here, hundreds of ordinary people who come to understand that they can have an impact. It starts with each of us. It starts with each of us being honest with ourselves and recognizing that we bear some of the responsibility for continuing a culture that tolerates sexual violence if we don't personally practice and teach empathy, if we don't exhibit and encourage compassion, if we don't talk with others around us, our families, our coworkers, our neighbors, about the imperative of replacing inattention with intervention. If we don't talk about what consent really means, if we don't talk with our public leaders about the fundamental immorality and inhumanity of passing on to new and future generations a culture that still tolerates sexual violence. What we are about is cultural change, and cultural change is not easy, but the change we seek is happening, and KSARC is leading the way. With resources it has created and refined over 4 decades. It can only continue to do that, though, if we continue our generous support. Each of us has to be an agent of change, advancing it person to person, parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, community to community. This morning, we have an exceptional opportunity to be agents of change by supporting KSARC with our financial commitments to its work. As we conclude this wonderful, energizing event, I want to ask you to be loud by taking action to make that imagination a reality. By speaking up, for example, about consent, about healthy relationships, about appropriate gender roles, by readily and openly denouncing comments that we've all heard. Perhaps we have even said, boys will be boys. She was asking for it. It was just locker room talk. And by rejecting sexually demeaning jokes and comments, and finally by confronting everyone with this astonishing reality that 1 in every 4 of our girls will be the victim of sexual violence while they're a child, and 1 in every 6 of our boys will be victims of sexual violence during their childhoods. How can that be? How can we let that be? So be loud this morning by being energized. As Mary Ellen said, the view from the podium here is just stunning. To see all of us here sharing a common concern and vision. So I ask all of us to be energized by this breakfast. I think you can all feel it. And I ask you to leave this breakfast this morning by taking some of that energy with you and sharing it with your communities, your families, your neighbors. Bridget, I wonder if you would come up and join me here. I knew she would. She's my granddaughter. Bridget, I want you to just ignore the fact that there are 1,000 people sitting out here in this room. Is there anything that you would like to share? People have been listening politely to me, but I know that they really want to hear from you.
Well, good morning. I just want to share my experience with KSARC and say that I was faced with the fact that I had never had conversations surrounding sexual assault. So when sexual assault affected someone in my life, I was blind to what I needed to do to help. That is why I believe these important conversations need to be happening with everyone, as sexual assault is a topic that must be talked about. My high school was a great place to begin talking. Starting the conversation was the first step in taking away the silence from sexual assault. This information about consent and boundaries was new for students and teachers. Talking about sexual assault in general was new, but it is a very important conversation to be having so that we can be informed and continue to spread and share this knowledge that we are learning. And that is why we are here today, so that you can all help keep the conversation going and start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you for your attention. I ask just one final thing, and that is that you be loud this morning by thinking carefully about the contribution you can make this morning through your gifts to KSARC. Mary Ellen mentioned the challenge pool, an extraordinary thing, 67,000 at this point. So I hope that you will be inspired by that and what you've heard this morning to consider your gifts carefully. If you're like me, you probably have come this morning with some idea in mind of how much you would give. I'm going to reevaluate that, and I hope that perhaps this will lead each of you to rethink that and to really rise to the challenge and give generously to keep this work going. That's the way to be loud, and I know that we can do that. Thank you very much, and remember to continue to be loud.